welcome to another episode of Light of the World. I'm Andrei Slivin, and we have a guest with us today, Nikita Zelensky, who is a contributing scientist to NASA. We'll start with a prayer. Царю Небесный, утешителю души истины, и же везде сы вся исполняй, сокровище благих и жизнь подателю, приди, вселисины и очистины от всяких скверны, и спаси блажи души наши. Аминь.
Аминь. Спасибо, Andrei. Thank you, Andrew.
Slava Bogu. Tell us about yourself.
Well, I came to the United States in 1950, and that's where I grew up. My parents are Russian, and I grew up speaking Russian. So I come to this church and to other churches when we were in Maine, which are Orthodox. So I feel a real affinity to this church especially and to the other churches that I attend. And I'd like to speak a little bit about science and religion, but first I should introduce myself. I do work as a contributing scientist for NASA, and we research the change in the sea level. And my job is to find the center of the Earth so that the measurements from the satellite can be referenced to the center of the Earth, and that's through the satellite's orbit. So the theme I think I'd like to pursue in our discussion is finding God in the book of nature. The book of nature initially started when I was little, the idea of a book of nature. And I was sent to a scout camp in the Adirondack wilderness where I would spend a month from when I was 8. And since I was so little, I fell under the radar, so I would just run around in the forest of this wilderness forest, and I gradually fell in love with this pristine nature. And I guess when you fall in love with something or someone, you become part of that. And I grew up loving nature, the outdoors. And later, when I became a scout leader myself, I would take the kids into the forests and try to teach them what I called the book of nature. And what I explained to them is that we're on the first page of the book of nature, and that what we have to learn are the words, and the words being the characteristics of the various animals and plants. And from knowing the words, we can construct the narrative of their interrelationships. So a book involves the idea of words and a narrative. And it's only later, much later, when I started reading the patristic fathers that I discovered that this term, the book of nature, was widely used and discussed by them in trying to describe the works of God, his creation. So let's turn our attention to that. What is the book of nature as described by the patristic fathers? I'm thinking of St. Basil specifically in particular. And he said that God gave man 2 books to better understand him and to glorify him. And that's the scriptures, and the second is the book of nature. And so in the book of nature, we have his creation and the Logos working through the world and driving all the processes of nature. And since man is made in the image of God, we have the capacity, in principle, to understand these processes. And so the question I have for the audience, whoever's listening, is in today's world, who studies the book of nature? And that's science, and scientists study the book of nature. We're studying something that should glorify God, and we're given the hope that we can understand all of these processes. There is a distinction between science and religion. And the distinction is very simple. Science is a method which was found that can be used to study and to discover new things in nature and to explain their structure through mathematics. Religion, I could say, is an institutionalized belief in God. So in principle, there is no
clashing of the two?
Yeah, there's no clash. There's no dispute between knowledge that is gleaned between the two institutions. There is something called scientism, and I don't know if you've heard of scientism. Scientism is a philosophy, it's a belief that it's only science that can provide the true answers. And scientism, in this form of philosophy, clashes with religion. In principle, science and religion do not oppose one another. They actually, in principle, should help one another. If you examine the purpose, the goals of each, they're different. Science wants to learn more about the natural processes and what the world that we live in, and religion tries to refine our belief in God so we become closer to God. And so the knowledge that we gain from religion is outside of this world. So they don't clash. What might clash is a philosophy that would deny religion's validity at expressing knowledge of God. Scientism is a philosophy that would say that only science can give what is truthfully exists in the world. And so, in principle, science and religion do not clash, or belief in God. So I'd like to go through kind of a development of scientific thought. It started with the scientific revolution, and up to the current age now, where we're living in the quantum universe. We first of all have to start with the idea of what science, how it evolves, or whether it actually progresses. And I'd like to think that there's a scientist called Max Planck, is a quantum scientist, physicist. He said that science progresses one funeral at a time. What he meant by that is he meant that people of a certain age grow up holding a certain idea of what is true, and they're loath to release that idea. And it's only when the new generation grows with a different idea that old idea is replaced by the new idea. And this is certainly true in what we would call a progress of science or the evolution of science. And so this all began with the scientific revolution. What happened, this is in the 1400s, probably earlier, was the Byzantine Empire was starting to fall apart. And you had a lot of immigrants or people who left Byzantium and came to the West, carrying with them the literature and the richness of their culture. Among them, works of the ancient Greeks, including Pythagoras. Now, Pythagoras is a very interesting figure because he had this mystical school in Greece which felt that number is the secret language by which man can understand and derive an explanation of the structures of the universe. Number is how God built the universe with, is what he said. So this idea that number in mathematics is a secret language inspired the people in the medieval ages and with the Renaissance to start looking at nature using mathematics. And their first object was to look at the celestial bodies, the planets revolving now, as we know, around the sun, but then it was considered the planets were revolving around the earth as well as the sun. It was revolving around the earth. And what really helped this view was the Ptolemaic calendar of these revolutions, where in the beginning of the first century, Ptolemy derived this very, very complex method of the rotation of the sun around the earth. And you can imagine, since the earth changes and it's ecliptic and it changes in a lot of ways in its revolution around the sun, these revolutions were very complicated. And they were complicated. But there was a system of actually predicting how the earth would be, how the sun would be around the earth in the year and the 2 years and so on. So people believed, and of course there was the biblical notion that God created the earth. And that was the first place which God created was the earth, and that's where man lived. So you had this in combination with the Ptolemaic system, which allowed this kind of clumsy description to exist and for it to be believed. But came along people who deeply believed in God, and they were looking for God's signature through mathematics. They were looking for God's signature in His creation, through the language of mathematics. And so you had Kepler, who looked at the planets and looked at the sun, and he decided that it's so much simpler. It's so much simpler to describe the rotation of the planets and of the earth to be around the sun than vice versa. And so he wrote a treatise on this, and which was accepted by a Catholic Church. And this is a period of time where you had Luther and you had this anti-church movement in Europe. And so the Catholic Church kind of resisted that with clamping down on this kind of dissension about having the earth move around the sun and other things in general. So they made Kepler's book illegal in their library, but you had other people like Galileo later, who was friends with the Pope, who said, look, let me study this through a telescope and I'll see what I find. And he came up with the same findings, that actually it's so much simpler to have the earth revolve around the sun. And he gave the manuscript to the Catholic Church, and they said, this is great. This is great. They were supporting this research. They said, this is great, but just change one thing. Don't say this is true, but just say it's mathematically simpler to describe it. That's all you have to say. And he thought about it, and he said, I can't say that, because if it's mathematically true, then it has to be true. And so this was the first big dissension about the church, the Catholic Church, talking and discussing the reality of the physical processes. And that was the birth of science. And unfortunately, the church didn't support that, the Catholic Church. Okay. So...
Is it because they were afraid that it would fall in line with Reformation ideas? Was that the concern, or were they just concerned about it supposedly going against Scripture?
It didn't go against Scripture. It didn't go against. There was nothing in the Scripture.
So, what do you think their concern was then?
I imagine it's the concern about the influence the Counter-Reformation was having. But I was going to say that this is a great topic to study, a great topic, and it's something that hasn't been studied as far as I know. And that's the first schism between science and the Catholic Church, was their reaction to Galileo's research.
Was there nothing like that in Byzantium, any dissensions, or was everything supported by the church in previous centuries?
No, there was no dissension about what was found by the science, and I'm not that familiar with the specifics. You see, it's difficult to say, because Saint Gregory Palamas in the 14th century believed in a flat Earth, for example. So I don't know. That's a good question. So I suspect that they just weren't part of that movement, but I don't know. Anyway, so in the West you had this development of technology with the telescope and with the observations using this technology. And later, Newton, who was not Catholic, he looked at the earth and he found three important rules that could describe all the motion. And that was the law of gravity, and how masses attract masses. One mass attracts another. The law of, there was three laws which describe all motion. I don't want to get into details. And that was important because they were intuitive. They were intuitive after you make an abstraction and you place our experimental world into outer space where there's no force of friction, because the force of friction is not a real force, but it's something that has to be removed it's an effect that has to be removed to make Newton's laws work. Okay. Previously, we had Aristotle, who tried to describe the motion using your intuition completely, which include the force of friction, the action of friction, and it isn't true. You can't use that to describe your universe at large. Whereas with Einstein, with Newton, you can, and he developed a world which became to look like a giant clock. And when you have something that's so kind of repetitive and understandable, it's hard to understand the need for God to run this. And so you had the rise of materialism, determinism, and something called deism, where you had the idea that perhaps if there is a God, God would wind up this giant clock and just relax. And unfortunately, some of this idea still remains in Catholic thinking, in my view, where how do miracles happen? God intervenes in the workings of the world, according to Catholic thought, to have a miracle. Whereas I think in Orthodoxy, God, the Logos, is always in the world, and everything is a miracle. So that's my view. Okay, so you had this universe, and along with the Newtonian universe, you have philosophies and ways of thinking which people believe that they have a kind of a sense of truth and a sense of progress from the previous eras. But in, I would say, the end of the 19th century, a lot of things were discovered through science which jarred, I would say, the comfort of the Newtonian universe. And that was what Einstein discovered. And he discovered that by measuring the time it would take one of Jupiter's moons to revolve around Jupiter and the speed of light he would measure the speed of light using that motion of the Jupiter's moon. And what he found in his measurements was that the speed of light, regardless of if the moon is receding or coming towards you, the speed of light is the same. And from that, he deduced that the speed of light is always the same, and it's only space and time that change to accommodate the speed of light. So as you're speeding faster in a spaceship, time would become slower. And that's a big change. And people at first didn't appreciate that. And with this general relativity theory, when you include gravity into the theory, and what that did is that you can picture the universe as a block universe where space, time, and our existence in this space-time is not a process of time. It's all static in this block universe. And that's difficult to understand or to believe because what we observe in the real world is that when we make an omelet, we can never make an egg from an omelet, or that we only remember our youth and not our old age. So time has an arrow, science believes. But anyway, Einstein's theory kind of has that possibility. And so that's a big dilemma. And it opens the mystery of the world that we live in. It opens, and so you ask, what is this world? And so you move away from a materialistic, deterministic description of a big clock to a more relativistic idea that really light is constant in this universe, which is an interesting idea in its own right. So with Einstein, you had other scientists who worked on looking at quantum, tiny particles of an atom. And what they found was that when you get beyond the things that you can observe and feel and touch, that they work in a universe which is not very intuitive at all, where we have these windows to reality called cause and effect, time, space, which they don't exactly exist for these tiny particles in this quantum universe, where the idea of cause and effect is challenged. It's no longer pertinent, where you have clouds of probability of existence, but not not particles, but clouds of probabilities of existence. And these clouds can intermingle, they can go through different places. And the only time you can observe a particle is when it appears and an observation is made. And you have a probability that it can appear in a certain space. That's all you have in quantum mechanics, is a probability. So for example, when you have radioactivity, you can imagine a particle which is in a well where it can't get out of that well, but there's a tiny possibility there's a tiny possibility that it can. And sometimes those particles get out of the well, and they're called radioactive particles, and measured by a Geiger counter. But the explanation, so this cause and effect has nothing to do with it, but probability. Einstein didn't like this. Einstein said, God doesn't play dice with the universe. But he couldn't offer another explanation. And there was further research in quantum mechanics. A lot of people, a lot of scientists in Europe, including Einstein, would meet regularly to discuss these findings, to try to make sense out of them. And there was one meeting in Copenhagen in the 30s, this is before the Second World War, where they tried to understand meaningfully what quantum mechanics is pointing at. So Schrödinger, another quantum mechanic physicist, proposed this thought experiment. He said, suppose you have a cat locked in a box, a quantum cat, and the box has one vial of poison. And there's a possibility that the cat will break that vial, and when you open the box, the cat will be dead. And there's another possibility that the cat will be alive. And so, what is the cat while it's inside the box? And so people at the meeting thought about this, and the only rational conclusion you can come to is the cat is both dead and alive while it's in the box. But when you open the box, the person discovers whether it's dead or alive. So what does that mean about the person?
By observation.
By observation.
Yeah.
So that means that the observer cannot be part of quantum mechanics. He can't be part of this quantum physics. He has to be outside. His consciousness has to be outside of quantum physics. And that's a big statement. That means the consciousness of a person is outside of the realm of physics to be able to tell you what's going on. That consciousness has a separate reality from the world that we live in.
Okay.
Okay.
So that
That's
the existence of a soul?
I'm sorry?
Is this sort of in line with like the existence of a soul, or are you talking about something different?
No.
Okay.
So this is the idea, the first departure from a really very deterministic, materialistic universe, the interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation, that our consciousness is outside of the realm of physics, of natural law. And a lot of scientists, many scientists didn't like that. So what they proposed was a multi-universe, the idea of a multi-universe. You must have heard of that.
Multi-universe theory.
Right, right. And so what you have there, you have Schrödinger's cat inside the box, and it's both dead and alive at the same time. But when the box is opened, it's opened on two worlds, a multi-universe world, one where the cat is dead and the other where the cat is alive. Okay. And so you have this growing multi-universe. And there's other reasons for having a multi-universe as well, but that's one of the reasons, was this need not to have our consciousness be outside of the laws of physics, okay? Okay, so there was one more, I'd like to mention one more fascinating discovery. That's called the entanglement of particles, particle entanglement. I think you might have heard of that, and that's where two particles exist so closely together that when they separate, the action on one particle will be immediately seen as an effect on the other particle as well, even though they're separated by much, light distances which are much larger than that information can travel. It's an immediate transfer of information. by the way. This is something that's called quantum computing. This is entanglement is based on quantum computing. Quantum computing is based on entanglement of particles. So
you're saying they could be in two separate rooms,
yes,
and you affect one, and the other one almost like
immediately is affected
with no delay.
No delay at all.
Wow. Okay.
And that's called entanglement of particles. Einstein, again, was present, and he said, spooky action at a distance. That's what he called it.
Yeah.
Because you can't explain it. But it's a fact, it's something that's observed, and something that is being used without being really very well understood to hopefully drive computers in quantum computing. I think you've heard this term, quantum computing. So you have this relationship, and what we've used up to this discovery and the thinking about this relationship between particles, entangled particles, was space and time as fundamental concepts in which we live and through which natural physics works, space and time. And now people have proposed that this entanglement is a more fundamental concept in which to construct our sense of reality than space and time, where we don't understand space and time yet. St. Augustine said that, of course, I know what time is unless someone asks me, and then I don't know what that is, roughly paraphrased. And space is also a mystery. So how can space change according to accommodate the speed of light? That's mysterious. And so we're encountering in our basic ideas these mysteries that challenge us to understand God's creation. So we're left with this idea of entanglement, and how do we move forward with that? And so I just want to suggest that St. Basil's thought that God gave us two books, and to better understand them holds more true now than ever, because we need to develop a new way of thinking to be able to understand the nature around us, and it challenges our imagination and our thought processes to try to explain this so that it makes sense. And St. Basil reassures us that since we are made in God's image, that we have the capacity to understand this unfolding nature and this unfolding mystery in nature.
I was giving a presentation in seminary, sort of like almost like a personal challenge. I wanted to present on this topic, Christianity and space exploration. Why aren't Christians across any facet of the religion, any sect of any kind, interested in the cosmos, at least as much as they were hundreds of years ago? And the answer I got from a few seminarians was, well, the stars have no significance in the story of our salvation. And I was like, what do you mean by that? And they're like, well, space is just space. It's who cares about it? Where in the Bible does it say we need to, pay attention to that in order to save our souls? And I took grievance with that statement. And I came up to Bishop Luke at one point before an evening service, and I was like, Vladika, Master, why did God make the stars? I want your take on this. And he said, well, Andrei, it's so that we can marvel at his creation. In the Psalms, there's literally a verse that says, he who calls the stars by their names. So each one bears a name. The Lord named each star. He made it for a reason. And I do agree that, their existence is, like I think Abraham Lincoln once said, I understand how a man can be an atheist while looking upon the earth, but I cannot conceive how he can look at the heavens and say there is no God. A famous saying. Yeah. But is there anything that you could contribute to that?
I'm glad I'm married, because
we had Nikita's wife just say, how about the Christmas star that guided the shepherds?
There is wonder when you look at the stars, and I think we have to wonder why it's not more praised in our traditional reading of the text. And I'm sure with the patristic fathers and their Greek background, there's a lot of open area to openness to descriptions found in nature to be able to describe God's work. And so we talk about the scriptures, and the scriptures, and you can think of Revelation, but I think I think of that as being expressed in the dogmas, a revelation through the scripture. But in the scriptures, when it's not dogma, I think we're open to a discussion. That's which is very good in Orthodoxy, because we are open to discussion. And so I think, my thought, and I don't think I stray too far when I say the Logos is intertwined with the world, and it's in the world, and it works through the world and through the natural processes. And that for each person, it differs. It differs as the working of the Logos. And I think that, theology, for example, is an attempt to try to understand the not understandable, and with the hope that this will lead us closer to God. So I think dialogue is good.
Yeah. Have you noticed in your own experience moments throughout your career, perhaps, where you felt a sudden, closeness with God, like upon examining a certain facet of your work?
Well, yeah, I usually find that I'm wrong. That really helps.
Socrates, humility.
Socrates. Well, yeah. Besides that, Socrates said, "The only true knowledge is accepting that I know nothing." And I think that's so refreshing to really come to a conclusion that in your life that you know very little. That's important, and you have a lot to learn.
So therefore, people that you said are fond of this idea of scientism and asserting the fact that God cannot exist because of X, Y, and Z, and the burden of proof, et cetera, they are mistaken in the idea that they believe that they're right about all their beliefs, because you yourself have seen many times that there has to be a reevaluation of what you know, because something new has come up, or you found out you were wrong about something.
Well, certainly I know I'm wrong in a lot of things. But I think any belief in any ideology is wrong. It's wrong because it's constructed by man. Ideas are constructed by man. You want to move, I don't know, faith is a big question, and the leap of faith. And I think that it comes from a revelation from God. And you can't rationally describe how it happens and why it happens. But I think faith means initially loyalty. But certainly it's loyalty to an idea. And faith in God is something special, which is mysterious and beyond language, I think. So that's separate. But I think that in terms of language and in terms of concepts that we deal with, I think it's wrong. It's wrong to absolutely believe in certain concepts because they're man-made and they're limited. The Trinity is a mystery, for example. Right. It's not a concept, it's a mystery. And what Gregory Palamas said is that to understand man in the image of God, you'll have to better understand the Trinity. And they're both mysteries. So I think that's from Greek, the Greek Orthodox thinking, that we have a rich school, that we have a lot to learn. Yeah. Okay. Anyway. Yeah.
Oh, that's very well said. I wanted to ask, I remember reading just for fun different pages, different forums where people explained why they were atheists, and many of them cited this statement called the burden of proof. They basically said that, science isn't that complicated. If you believe in a God, in order to assert that he is real and that he exists, you have to show me in a tangible way, how is he real? You have to prove it to me. What can you say about that? Do you just have to separate the two? Because I remember you said earlier that, the two don't clash with each other. And here are people saying that they do. Because you cannot pull God out of a closet, he therefore cannot exist.
Well, I think we're all subject to the human condition. And what is the human condition? Is that we live, we suffer, and we have joy, and we die. And what's the explanation to the human condition? And I think it's not. I think for every person, it's a different explanation that they come to, and I think Hannah Arendt had said that reason is not there to seek truth, but it's to seek meaning. Reason, and so I would disagree with that, but that's also an individual thing that happens with people. I would disagree and say that you need faith to find meaning and not reason. And so I would think that people who have suffered or who have not suffered would find that reason is the answer to finding meaning. And for them, reason, I don't think you can have a proof of God through reason. I don't think. So, in short, that's the answer.
There was a video that I made in seminary on the same topic I spoke about called Christianity in Space Exploration. I have it on YouTube still. I had braces at the time, so I have a very thick lisp while I'm talking. It's terrible. But, I went and I did the work and I looked up what did the people who actually went into space say and do when they were out there. So you had the first, people on the moon, and what did they say? When they were first orbiting the moon before they landed, it's just their sort of trial run before they actually, fixed their spacecraft on there. They were reading from the book of Genesis.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness.
And then they were told afterwards, don't ever do that again. But this was a spontaneous action that they undertook because they were in such awe. Yuri Gagarin, when he went to space, I think the famous quote attributed to him for many decades afterwards was that he said, "I went to space and I went to the heavens and I didn't see God." And I did some.
I don't think
he didn't actually say that. You're correct. Yeah, he never said that. But the Communist Party fabricated that quote and then put it out everywhere. Turns out what he actually said, which was uncovered many years later, was that a cosmonaut cannot be in space and hover, in the heavens and not believe in God, right? I'm sure that's why personally, I know it's not very realistic, but if I had the opportunity to be out there, I would take it in a heartbeat, despite all the risks, just for a moment, just to see how, insignificant we are and sort of stand in fear before God, I found that very moving, It turns out the first people that went to the moon and orbited around it, their initial reaction wasn't to say, "Oh, wow, look at this. There's so much out there. Clearly, we're limited in our beliefs about religion and God can't exist because there's just so much out there. We can't even fathom it." The opposite occurred. They were like, "Oh, I'm scared." Like, there's a Russian quote, "Гром не грянет, мужик не перекрестится," which translates to, a peasant won't cross himself until the thunder strikes.
Yeah. Well, I felt a bit the same way when living in the forest when I was little. I felt a bit the same way. There's a sense of awe. And when you are inspired by that beauty and the sense of awe, you start believing in God. Whether, when I didn't know I'd call it God. When I was very little, and my father, I was 4, I think maybe 4, maybe even 3, my father described that God exists. And I said, "Well, where is he?" And my father said, "Well, he's everywhere." I said, "Well, even under this bed?" He said, "Yes, under this bed." "And even in the air?" He said, "Yes, in the air." And then my father says, "Nikita, what are you doing?" And I was going like this. "I'm tickling God." And so when you are little, you have a different perception of what God is. But I think it's when I was little, until maybe the age of 12 or so, God was something magnificent, and you're inspired by beauty and a sense of awe, and you felt that this somehow was your God, and you loved it. And it's only when you try to conceptualize things later then you had problems.
Interesting. No wonder it was said, be like children.
Yeah. So that's when I would take the scouts into the forest. I have this idea that to inspire them with a sense of awe of the natural beauty.
Well, you've also led youth discussions in our parish previously where you spoke about these topics. What is, I think, a fundamental concept that you think parents should be teaching their children about, the book of life, about the book of nature?
The only thing I would say, I would think is important, a sense of love, to see wonder in the world around us, and to see, and not to be clamped down to one way of thinking, to see wonder and be wondrous, and to be inspired by this wonder. But that's a lot to ask. It's a lot to ask. Yeah,
it requires a bit of focus in a ever focused less world.
Yeah, more world and less idea, but more world.
More actual world, right?
Yeah.
The actual experience.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Jordanville helps with that because you're out in the middle of nowhere.
That's right.
So you have no choice but to experience the world. And we're not there right now. We're in Washington, D.C., in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. But sometimes walking out of a vigil in the evening when it's still sun outside, I kind of feel that, that sort of childish just wonder of how, beautiful the sky is and everything around us. I can hear it moving other people too. They'll walk out and they'll be like, oh, this is beautiful.
Yeah, I believe we're mysteriously made.
Mysteriously made, yeah.
Fearsomely and mysteriously made. And we have a big hole in our heart which must be filled.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk about one last thing here.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I noticed that in one of your points you wrote about relativity and the Big Bang.
The Big Bang, I forgot to speak.
Which was another misconception, I think, in modern times where people are like, oh, this goes directly against our, Christian beliefs, despite the fact that
relativity?
Not relativity, sorry.
The Big Bang?
Yeah, because it was created by a priest, right? The theory itself.
The theory was yeah.
Let there be light.
That's right.
I would argue that it is scripturally supported.
Let there be light, yeah.
And if God created the universe, then He was the center of it, so everything came from Him.
Exactly. And,
right.
And the priest, I forgot his name, but he was a Catholic priest in the 30s this was his theory. And he was ignored until you had better measurements that showed that indeed, going back in time, like years and years, that there was a point where all of these galaxies came from one. There was a point in time. It came from one point in time. I mean, that was an important point that I missed.
But you could be argued, though. I mean, I don't understand how someone could look at that and then say it would have to be a very primitive argument, for someone to state that because this theory exists, it is conflicting with the existence of God. I don't see it that way. I'd say it supports it, and I think that a fear that people have is that there's this idea that, well, if this is true, then there means that this happened at a certain point in time. So what existed before that?
Well,
right?
I'll explain this.
Sure. The infinite. Could you talk about that?
Yes, I think a very important discovery or theorem in science is the Big Bang. And before, astronomers felt that there was a steady state or a steady state of expansion. And only when we got better instruments to measure the motion of galaxies, that it was found that they appear to have originated at a single point in time. And there was a Catholic priest who was also an astronomer. He proposed the Big Bang theory. And in this theory, there was no space or time or the world before that point, that mysterious point, when there was this explosion of existence this explosion, this bubble of our space, time, and laws. And so in matter and mass and energy and everything that we describe in our physical processes, there was a point where it didn't exist. And that dumbfounds not some people who believe in God, but people who would believe that God does not exist, because this points to a creation of the universe that started with light. And this is mysterious. And there is a lot of active research trying to say this perhaps is not true by people who don't like the idea that there was a creation.
A question that I have, I guess, it could almost be a rhetorical question for the scientists that are convinced that God was not behind this point of creation, this origin, would be, well, is this correct? There's a law that states that energy, or does it matter, cannot be created or destroyed?
Both. Energy
right.
and mass are interrelated through relativity.
Right. And they cannot be created or destroyed. So if everything came from a single point, and if it wasn't God that started this, how could, nothingness have created something?
Well, it dazzles the imagination, doesn't it?
Right.
And they don't like
the only answer left is that there is a creator behind it. I cannot understand any sort of other, argument being proposed.
Nor I. How wondrous are thy works, O Lord, how deep are thy thoughts. And I think this is inspiring to think about the universe and about God and the mystery of our unknowing God. I think this is a wonderful Psalm 92:5. Another where I wanted to mention the idea of microcosm, macrocosm. And the idea is, the question is, how does a person recognize design in nature? And you can have different designs, but we somehow recognize these designs. And one of the medieval thoughts is that the design of the human being reflects the design of the cosmos, and they're the same in some aspects. And our design recognizes the outward design as well. And that's the idea of the microcosm, macrocosm. And so we ask the question, as we unravel this mystery, who are we as human beings? What is consciousness?
Maybe we'll have another episode about it one day.
Okay.
Yeah. This was a very, very pleasant conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. No, it was wonderful to talk to you.
I can't wait to post it and edit all the different, pictures and diagrams over.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Спасибо, Nikita.
Спасибо тебе, Андрюша.
Glory to God. Slava Bogu.
Да, слава Богу.
Wait, if you like this show, that means the world to me. Glory to God. I love making episodes. I want to make even more at a faster rate and expand the show. I can't do this without your support, though. Each episode takes many, many hours to make. If you want to help me, paypal.me/Andre Slivin. Thank you, and God bless you.